in the area of finite element modeling, where you study microstructures, one of the things that you need to identify is a unit cell or a representative volume element. In fact, these two things are widely confused concepts. People that like to use unit cells always swear by it, and they think that this is the only kind of representation that you can use to model systems. While on the other hand, people that like to use RVEs tend to think that any model that is built without an appropriate representative volume element is actually a wrong model. In fact, what I'm going to do in this video is try and bust the myth between these two ideas. I would like to show you which one to use for which type of model, so that in the end you'll be making the right choice for whatever simulation you're trying to run. So let's sit back and relax as we get started with this modeling. So as we get started with this, the outline that we're going to do with this video is first I want to introduce the idea of a virtual domain. What is a virtual domain? Because if we understand what a virtual domain is, then we can understand what a unit cell and an RVE is. Then I'll try to explain what a unit cell and an RVE represent, what are they. We'll look at the examples of unit cells and RVEs. When should you also use either of these two? I will try to explain that. Of course, there are pros and cons for the use of unit cells and RVE, so we'll also explore that. And then finally, I'll provide a commentary on what I've called the predictive fidelity of your choice of whether to do an RVE or a unit cell. And so these are the ideas that we're going to be going through in this video. So we'll start with this first question of what a virtual domain actually represent. And I like to use that word virtual domain as against something like a geometry, which some other people like to use, because a virtual domain is really what we're trying to do with finite element modeling. We're not trying to recreate the geometry. We're actually trying to create a virtual environment that captures the construct, the physical construct that we're trying to model. So a virtual domain is basically an idealized construct that house the physical problem so that numerical computations can be undertaken on them. So they are idealized, they are to represent the physical domain, and the essence really is that you want to be able to do a numerical study on them. You can illustrate this using this example of a soda can. It's starting off with an excellent picture like this, and if I want to undertake a numerical study on that, I need to create an idealized representation of that. And so this is what my idealized representation of the soda can would look like. So with this idealized representation, then I can go on to apply some pressure on the Coke can, and then you create the simulation that you want to study. So my idealized representation, which is the virtual domain in this case, to what extent does it represent in reality the physical Coke can or soda can? Of course, that's some study that we can look at later on. But the principle is that whatever I'm calling my virtual domain should be some kind of a quid pro quo representation of my physical problem in order to do that study. Also, bearing in mind this idea of a virtual domain, you would have subsets of a virtual domain. These are kind of breakdowns of the virtual domain. And the way I look at this is that the virtual domain is kind of the overarching arc that encompasses everything. Within it would have a representative volume element, and also within a representative volume element you could have a unit cell. This is obviously only in one condition: if the domain has repeating microstructure across the domain. But we're going to speak about that. But for a start, I just want us to see that the overarching umbrella of that virtual construct is the virtual domain, and within a virtual domain we could have an aspect which we'll call a representative volume element, and also within a representative volume element we can isolate a region which we'll call the unit cell. And that's where the relationship lies between the virtual domain, the RVE, and the unit cell, and we're going to start with that. Now let's think about the word the unit cell. And a unit cell is the smallest repeating representation of a virtual domain that can be isolated for use in numerical analysis. The smallest repeating unit here is called a cell, and that word cell obviously is taken from cellular biology of systems, whereby the smallest unit of life is called a cell. So in the same philosophy, if you're looking at analyzing a structure that has repeating pattern in it, then the smallest unit of that repeating pattern is called a cell, and that becomes a unit cell. So the next thing to think about is what is a representative volume element, and I've taken the liberty of defining representative volume element by extracting a definition in this textbook, which is a book that I wrote a few years ago. And in one of the chapters of the book, I defined RVE as a subset of a virtual domain that captures the entirety of the physical problem such that the FEM solution can still be obtained without loss of generality or accuracy. So there's a few things to think about as we consider that. The first thing is that the RVE must be a subset of the physical domain. So that means it's not necessarily exactly the same as the virtual domain, but a subset of the virtual domain. The second thing about the RVE is that it should be good enough for you to accomplish the finite element solution without losing the fact that you can generalize the solution from your FE without realizing the fact that the accuracy of that solution. So those two things must be in place. And for this to be possible, the key word in RVE is the word representative. So the domain that you're choosing, the subset that you're choosing for your RVE has to be representative of the entire bulk. The next point that we need to make about RVE is that they are never the exact equivalent of the geometry or the virtual domain that you are considering. So the word representative introduces the idea of a way of measuring it, and that brings on the idea of representability indices associated with your solution. And such indices can be things like, the nearest neighbor distances of the particles that make up the virtual domain, and so on and so forth. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So now that we have a definition for RVEs and unit cells, so the next thing to think about is, can we look for examples of what a unit cell is and what an RVE is? So in terms of a unit cell, so the first example I want to look out for is in the area of composite mechanics. So let's consider a glass fiber reinforced unidirectional composite, and the microstructure would have fibers essentially distributed within a matrix medium. So let's assume that the fibers have an ordered arrangement as shown here. So with an ordered arrangement like this, we can isolate unit cells because the particles are repeatable and they are ordered in the arrangement. So we can isolate unit cells. So you could have a square unit cell or a hexagonal unit cell. And these are typical examples of unit cells that can be extracted from this kind of domain. The other example to consider when we are looking at examples of unit cell is, let's say, a lattice cell structure. And I'm particularly focusing on this sandwich arrangement where we have a hexagonal unit cell lattice structure. So again, we could isolate a unit cell, which is a hexagonal unit cell in this case. And in principle, we can use whether it's a hexagonal unit cell or the square unit cell for the UD composite. We can use it to run our simulation and it will be fine. So these are examples of what you can get under the unit cell. Now let's look at the next example, which is the example for representative volume elements. So with a representative volume element, the first example we're going to look at is still the glass fiber reinforced UD composite, but this time around we would look at a truly random arrangement of UD composites, which is kind of how it really appears in reality. So we're not going to make any assumptions about the distribution of the particles. We're going to say the particles will appear however they are in a kind of a random way, and in that instance there is no more a repeating pattern. So we can't easily isolate a unit cell, because for unit cells to work, you need a repeating pattern. But for RVEs, we don't need that requirement of a repeating pattern. What we need is a representability of the solution. And so we could isolate these three types of RVEs: RVE1, RVE2, RVE3. So in isolating them, the size becomes an issue. So what size is sizable enough? What size is too small? What size is too big? And how do I actually know that this isolated RV1, RV2, and RV3 are actually representative of the domain? But that's a question for a different time. But what I'm trying to say here is that these are examples of RVEs. Let's look at another example, something a little bit less intuitive. So let's look at an example of a simple tensile test specimen, and it's got an open hole in it, an open hole tensile test specimen. So it's held at the back and it's being pulled at the front as shown here. So we can isolate two possible RVEs for this tensile specimen, because clearly this is a virtual domain here. Now, what we see on the right are two examples of an RVE. So the first RVE1 will be essentially dividing the the test specimen into two and just using 1/2. And here we're exploiting the fact there is a symmetry associated to the solution. So we can just model the upper half and introduce intelligently some kind of boundary conditions to help us. So that's an RVE1. Someone may move on and become really ambitious and say, okay, I want to even model a smaller representative volume element of this domain. And so here they are modeling a quarter of the model. So again, that quarter is a representative volume element, in this case RVE2. And so again, some intelligence about how the boundary conditions are applied. But the idea is that in the long run, hopefully you should recover the expected constitutive behavior that the solution is exploring. So two good examples of what an RVE represents, as well as two good examples of what a unit cell is. The next thing that clearly you would like to know is where exactly should I be using a unit cell, or under what condition should I be using an RVE? And I want to address that right away. So the first point here is, where should I use a unit cell? And there are things to look out for in terms of using a unit. The first point is that there has to be a clear, periodic, repeating microstructure. Every microstructure where there is repeatability in the microstructural distribution of particles, then you can clearly identify a unit cell, because the unit cell has to be the smallest unit within that repeating pattern, and then you can use that. So that's number one point. The number two things to look out for in terms of using a unit cell is that the model has to have a simplistic boundary or loading condition, such that transfer of the load through the structure is actually uniform. Because as soon as there is a non-uniformity of loading on the domain, then the unit cell will no more be applicable. Because what you're trying to do by isolating a unit cell is something that can represent the full bulk, but still useful in generating the correct solution. And so your boundary condition has to be sort of simple. Things like maybe a purely uniaxial loading, a pure shear loading, so that everywhere across the microstructure of the virtual domain, the loading would be uniaxial or shear, or even some measure of combination of those two. But as soon as you deviate from that and have some parts being in shear and some part being in tension, then you can't really isolate a unit cell for the domain. So that's number 2 point. The third point is what I like to describe as material homogeneity across the bulk. So everywhere in the bulk, there has to be a homogeneous distribution of particles. As soon as you introduce something that deviates from that homogeneous distribution of particles, let's say there is a crack somewhere, there's a void somewhere, or maybe a mixture of particles within the microstructure, or maybe the diameters of the ingredients are different, there's no more homogeneity in material distribution. So in that instance, we are not going to be using a unit cell. So let's look at a good example. So if we're trying to model a hybrid composite that have, let's say, 3 laminates of hybrids in them. So maybe the top one is a jute, the second one is a hemp, and the third one is a pineapple fibers. The diameter of the jute fiber will be different from the diameter of the hemp and from the diameter of the pineapple. In that instance, you can't isolate clearly a unit cell. However, someone could say, okay, why not isolate a unit cell only for the jute? Maybe it's possible, only for the hemp and only for the pineapple. But even when you isolate them individually, you end up with 3 unit cells, but it's not easy to homogenize the solution to generate, let's say, a stress strain graph for the whole virtual domain. So in which case, those things are not really unit cells in them. The fourth point is a consequence of the point that we've made before. There has to be uniformity of stress distribution across the domain. You don't want to see any evidence of stress concentrator in the domain. So if there is points where stress concentrators exist in the domain, then you can't really isolate a unit cell. And so that's the fourth point that we need to bear in mind. So the next point is, where should I then use an RVE if I'm going to run a simulation? The simple way is that whatever does not uphold in the first instance above will be applicable here. So where you cannot use a unit cell, then the default position is find what is a representative volume element for the domain. So the next thing to think about is, what are the pros of using a unit cell over the RVE? So in the first instance, the way I like to do this is have a column for the unit cell and a column for the RVE, and then we'll discuss exactly what is applicable here. The first benefit or the pro for using a unit cell is that it's quite easy to isolate and create a virtual domain for that. On the RVE side, it's not easy to isolate what your representative volume is. The next benefit of using a unit cell over the RVE is that no need to assess or quantify the repeatability of the virtual domain. Now, on the other side, you really need to introduce another measure, a repeatability index. Now, the third thing that we need to see as a benefit of using the unit cell over the RVE is that a unit cell solution is actually computationally cheap, as only fewest number of simulations can actually be captured. However, in terms of the RVE, is computationally expensive due to the need for you to carry extra simulations to quantify representability as well as the normal simulation you want to carry out. Now, the fourth point here is homogenization from a unit cell to macro scale is often straightforward, because the essence of really using a unit cell on RVE is to come up with a constitutive behavior that represents a bulk. However, for an RVE, homogenization is actually not simple, because there is the possibility for you to do multi-scale homogenization, which requires you to, to track the variables that you're assessing across multiple length scales. Then the final point, as a benefit of using unit cells over RVE, is that the loading type for the domain is relatively straightforward. I mean, this is implicit in the point that I made previously to say that, but once you start having maybe multiple complicated loading where there is a variable loading across the microstructure, then a unit cell is no more indicated. However, for the RVEs, loading types are quite complex, and then extra computational care will have to be given to the domain in order to isolate what your RVE is useful for that kind of scenario. So that's the benefit of using a unit cell over an RVE. Now let's think about the con of using a unit cell over the RVE. In other words, what are the disadvantages of using a unit cell in comparison to an RVE? And the first point here is that only few real-life problems are actually truly periodic. So the scale of problems that are solvable using a unit cell are quite limited. While on the other side, RVEs are truly designed for real-life problems, and limited range of problems can be solved with RVEs. Now, the second disadvantage that the numerical results are usually not robust or rigorous enough, as the findings are generally limited because the geometry is limited, the boundary condition or the loading type you're using is limited. So in terms of scalability of the solution, you would say that with a unit cell, there is really not much rigor or robustness to your solution. While on the other side, in RVE, they are really truly widespread and far-reaching conclusions can be derived here due to the fact that the geometry is robust because you've assessed for repeatability, and then the boundary condition is representative of the actual structure that you're trying to study. The third disadvantage of using a unit cell over an RVE is that the scaling up of solutions from a unit cell to structural scales will be done with great care and quite a lot of restriction. However, it is easy to scale up findings from the representative volume element to a structural scale problem. What I mean by that is, let's say, you're trying to model the behavior of a composite fan blade. If you have identified your unit cell to be just maybe a square arrangement, it's quite difficult to start from a square cell unit cell arrangement and scale that up onto modeling what's happening in a composite fan blade. However, if you can identify what becomes a representative volume element for that composite fan blade, the scale up from the RVE to the structural scale, it's straightforward. So again, that means the impact of the results you're generating from the RVE is much, much better than what you generate from a unit cell. The next thing I would like to talk about is the predictive fidelity of your solution, and this depends on whether you're choosing a unit cell or an RVE. But what is the predictive fidelity? And predictive fidelity talks about how reliable your predictions are, how dependable are they in terms of real life, utilization of the findings from your solution. And so, first thing is that RVEs tend to give you improved predictive fidelity. So if you're isolating an RVE, you tend to have better prediction than using a unit cell. Now, entire models or analysis can be reliably carried out without loss of generality or accuracy if you're working with an RVE comparison to a unit cell. Now, the third point is that RVE inherits the complexity of the full virtual domain, albeit with a reduction of computational cost. So the essence of going the RVE route is that you want to scale down a really complex virtual domain to something that is manageable, that is representative of that domain. But it doesn't mean you have lost the complexity of the original domain. It's just that you've scaled it down so your computational cost is cheaper, and then you can actually maybe use the computer resources available to you. The fourth point is that you need to assess the representability index of your RVE with respect to the model outputs of interest. So you must make sure that what you're using as an RVE is really, truly representative of the virtual domain, for you to then say, yeah, my result, my conclusion, it has a high predictive fidelity. And then the next thing to say here is that if the model analysis will not benefit from use of RVE, always use a unit cell. But you have to choose this with caution. So in terms of predictive fidelity, if your solution does not depend, would not vary if you use a unit cell over an RVE, it's part of the benefit of an RVE, then just go ahead and use a unit cell, because that's what it is there for. A unit cell is the smallest unit, makes solution easy, and a lot of things that can be solved quickly from it, computationally cheap. So go ahead and use it. However, if for any reason you doubt that the use of a unit cell would have impact on the predictive fidelity of your solution, then don't use a unit cell. Go ahead and identify, isolate what an RVE you need to use for that. So finally, if you really want to go ahead and explore a little bit more around the ideas that I've shared in this video, please do look at this book that I referred to earlier on, where I have a section where I discuss about these things. And if you like the content that I've made here, please do subscribe on this channel and let me know in the comments what you think about the whole idea. Thank you for your interest in this channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.